Good day. Welcome to Western Hills Baptist Church. New book today, Book of Esther. In the Book of Esther, we see God's care watching over the Jews that had returned out of captivity back to their own land. And we read the great and wonderful things that were done for them, even to the Jews who were scattered in the provinces of the heathen. The Jewish people, they've been wonderfully preserved, even when doomed to destruction. And we see God watching over his own. The book of Esther, it's unknown who wrote the book. There are many who doubt that the book should even be in the Bible. Personally, I believe the writer to be Mordecai for the fact that he wrote an account about Haman's plot to destroy the Jews, which was foiled. Today, that's known as the Feast of Purim. There's other reasons I believe the writer to be Mordecai. The storyline of Esther is the narrative of a plot laid against the Jews to cut them off, to do them in. But the plot was foiled by a sequence of God's intervention that prevented that from happening. Again, it's a storyline, and we see God's preserving the Jews throughout persecution. With that, let's get into it. Esther chapter 1, verse 1 reads, Now it came to pass in the days of Ascrosh, this was the Ascrosh who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. This is King Ascrosh. Ascrosh is well known in history, though his name is more commonly called Xerxes. The king inherited the vast Persian Empire from his father Darius I, who was mentioned back in Ezra chapters 4, 5, and 6. Verse 2. It says, In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the citadel. So at this time, it's approximately 483 BC. It's about 483 BC. And Ahasuerus was planning for a doomed invasion of Greece, which would take place several years later. It was at this time the city of Athens was in its classical glory, and in Greece they were celebrating the 79th Olympic Games. In its day, the Persian Empire was the largest in the world. It covered what we call today Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel, and also modern parts of Egypt, Sudan, Libya, and Arabia. Verse 3. And in the third reign, that in the third year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the princes of the provinces before him. In the third year of his reign, Xerxes, he gave a great banquet to display his wealth and glory. The purpose of this might have been to make plans for his forthcoming Greek campaign. His nobles, military, political leaders of Persia and Media, they'd all be present there. Now, some of these Persian banquets, they would have upwards of 15,000 guests that would be entertained at once. Verse 4, When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. For 180 days, it's a half a year. Xerxes displayed his vast wealth and royal regalia to his guests. Of course, a question is raised here as to whether the guests could have exercised their administrative duties and also whether all that had been present were there during the 180 days. It could be most likely that there was some type of rotation. They would come and go, so they could all experience the king's hospitality. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. A 7-day banquet was given for all the men who were in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least. So we're talking both nobles and commoners. They were included. In this banquet, it was held in the king's enclosed garden, and which was normal, as Persian palaces usually stood in the midst of a park surrounded by a fortified wall. Verse 6. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and white and black marble. You have to appreciate the eyewitness accuracy that the author uses here. He describes the white and blue linen hangings in the garden that were fastened with cords to silver rings on marble pillars. He described couches of silver, gold, placed on mosaic paver of alabaster, turquoise, and black and white marble. Archaeologists have found the remains of Xerxes' palace and have verified the accuracy of the riches described in this verse. Verse 7, and they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. It says here that wine was served in golden goblets, no two alike. No two alike. History has it that these vessels were taken from the temple in Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC. Wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. So the king assured an abundant supply of wine for everybody. Verse 8. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for so the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. What this is saying is that no one was compelled to drink at the same time. No restrictions were placed on what a guest could consume. The king's wine stewards had been instructed to serve each man whatever he wanted, however much or however little. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So at the same time that the men were being entertained by the king, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Besra, Harbona, Bigtha, Agbatha, Zethar, and Caracas, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. It says here on the 7th day of the feast. So the last day of the feast, this is when the king was, let's say, in high spirits, and he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring the queen before him wearing the crown so that he might display her beauty to the assembled guess. Now, some Jewish sources interpret the order to mean that she was to appear nude except for her crown, but we don't know that. But we do know that spirits can make you do strange things. They're called spirits for a reason, talking about alcohol. Eunuchs. Eunuchs are usually associated with the king's harem, but they also played important roles in political and administrative affairs. They did more than just hang out with the harem there. So you have to think about the setting here. Here you have Queen Vashti. She's sitting in the royal seat, probably having her own banquet with the women. But Esther was probably there as well, at the queen's banquet, taking advantage of the events of the day for the sake of her people. And one thing that both Queen Vashti and Esther had in common was they were both beautiful women. Verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Now, probably the reason the queen, Vashti, refused to come to the party was lack of protocol shown by the servants of the king to the wife here, to the queen. In the king's drunkenness, he sent 7 of these servants, these eunuchs, to command the queen to come. And that was a disgrace given to the queen. So when the queen refused to answer the king's summon, he became enraged. His male ego suffered a public offense. Verse 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for this was the king's manner toward all who knew law and justice, those closest to him being Karshana, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Murakan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who had access to the king's presence and who ranked highest in the kingdom. So we find here the king is very angered by Vashti's disobedience. And the king consulted his wise men who understood the times to determine what should be done to her. Now, understood the times. This is telling us that these wise men were astrologers and magicians who gave counsel according to the reading of celestial occurrences. And it was the king's custom to consult experts in matters of law and justice and to hear their options before he acted on any matter here. So there were 7 of these men we find here, all with Persian names, and they were 7 nobles. And they could have probably been the council of 7 members mentioned back in Ezra 7. We don't know. Whatever, their high rank allowed them special access to the king's presence. Verse 15. So the king says, what shall we do with Queen Vashti according to law? Because she did not obey the command of the king Xerxes brought to her by the eunuch. So the king So the king asks, what shall we do? The king wanted to know what could be done legally to the queen for disobeying his command. While it seems strange that the king would have to consult others before dealing with a rebellious wife, apparently she was protected from sudden behavioral changes of the king. Verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. Memucan, probably the spokesman for the 7 nobles, advised the king that Vashti had not done only wrong to the king, but also the nobles and all the people throughout the provinces of the kingdom. Why? The next two verses explain why her offense affected all the people. Verse 17. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus, they will be excessive contempt and wrath. So, more was involved than the queen's outrage to the king. Memucan, using keen perception, saw that if it left unpunished, Vashti's rebellious attitude toward her husband would influence other women in the kingdom to rebel against their husband's authority. I mean, after all, if the defiant queen could successfully ignore the king's commands, the nobles anticipated that there would be no end of disrespect and discord in their own homes. If the queen did not obey her husband, the king, the wives of lesser nobles would be encouraged to disobey their husbands. Verse 19. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her position to another who is better than she. So here, Memucan advises immediate and drastic action to deal with the situation. He spoke respectful to the king, as it says here, if it pleases the king. And Memucan advised Xerxes to issue a royal decree to be included among the laws of the Persians and the Medes that could not be repealed. The decree would forbid Vashti from ever again entering the presence of the king and would give her position to someone better than her. Better than her. What does that mean? In the Hebrew, it could mean a more beautiful or a more virtuous woman. The advisors, they wanted to be sure that Vashti could never again be restored to the king's favor, lest she take vengeance on them. Verse 20. When the king's decree, which he will make, is proclaimed throughout all his empire, for it is great, all wives will honor their husbands, both great and small. So Memucan further advised the king to proclaim the decree. Let the decree be heard throughout the empire, so that all women, from the least to the greatest, in other words, from the great into the small, a phrase that speaks of, let's say, age or physical size or social status, that all wives will honor their husbands. Many versions say respect. All women would respect their husbands. I like the way the Hebrew language is rendered, though. The Hebrew uses such terms for honor as wealthy, costliness, dignity, precious. So to me, this would be better rendered that a woman should value her husband with dignity. And frankly, if a husband treated his wife with respect and dignity, I would think that she would reciprocate in like manner. Verse 21. In the reply pleased the king and the princess, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. So the king liked the answer that Memucan provided, and the word was good in the eyes of the king, and the king did according to the word of Memucan. Verse 22. Then he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province in its own script, and to every people in their own language, that each man should be master in his own house and speak in the language of his own people. So the king did, as Memucan had suggested. Xerxes, he ordered letters to be sent to every part of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language. Many languages were spoken in the Persian Empire, so he wanted to be sure that all subjects, all people who spoke different languages and used different written scripts, understood the decree. The king was ensuring the decree was understood for all in all parts of the empire, from Egypt to India. In the decree, it claimed that every man should be ruler over his own household. Uh, Persia was noted for its excellent postal system, so it was not long before the contents of the king's decree were known throughout the kingdom there. Next week, we're going to be picking up with chapter 2, where the king remembers Queen Vashti and the decree that he put against her. We'll pick it up next week. Amen and amen.